Hi, my name is Carol Barrett. I work for Intel and I'm part of the product working group. I want to thank Mark and Joe for putting this together and all of you for coming here so that we could get a chance to meet with you and talk today. We want to talk about a couple of things over the next half an hour or so. So talk a little bit about what the product work group is, what our goal is within the community, how you can go ahead and join us and help us, and then talk a little bit about the roadmap, which is one of the things that we create and help to publish outside of the community and within the community, and then user stories, which is the unit by which we capture requirements and input from customers, operators, end users, a whole ecosystem partners, a whole variety of folks who come together to create solutions that are deployable and manageable by people around OpenStack. And then last but not least, we want to talk with you and get your questions and help provide answers where we can. So the product work group has a charter around three key things. First one is increasing the flow of the voice of the markets, operators, and users into the development process of OpenStack, helping people to understand what are the real requirements and the needs, how do we translate those into cross-project specs, and blueprints, and into things that are actionable by the developers in the community. That's the first thing that we do. Then the next thing is taking that and helping to facilitate the development around those user stories that tend to be across projects and across releases to let us make that translation and then track them through the development process, be able to see how are we doing, are we on track to getting the full set of capabilities implemented in all the projects. Where we're not on track, what can we do to go ahead and solve that problem? And then be able to communicate that and share that across the community and outside the community. And then the last thing is taking all of that information of what people are looking for, what we are planning to build, and what's being built today, and creating a multi-release cross-project roadmap for the community and being able to communicate that inside of the community to prospective customers, press analysts, all of the people who might be interested in OpenStack, and help to go ahead and make decisions based upon those roadmaps. Who's inside of the group is, OpenStack's sort of an interesting open source project. I tend to call it a corporate-sponsored open source community, in that 80% of the resources that are contributing upstream code actually come from 20% of the companies within the community. And that's a unique dynamic, but it's also something that can be very powerful for us. And so one of the principles of the product work group is looking to ensure that we can tap the both market knowledge and the feedback and input from customers, as well as the development contribution and expertise of the companies to allow us to go ahead and advance the product. Yeah?
I was just saying, you just said you thought that was a unique thing, but isn't a statistic a bit like that the case for, say, Linux as well?
I actually don't, so I'm not a Linux expert, but my understanding of that, there's other attributes around Linux that are unique and different than OpenStack, is that there's more of a, if you will, volunteer army around the contributions to the Linux kernel than you find in OpenStack. So. And so what you see here are some of the companies that are actively participating and helping to develop the user stories and to move them through to execution in the community. And we have some of those folks here tonight because we were in town for a couple of reasons this week. One was the Ops mid-cycle meetup that was going on in Manchester earlier this week. And then we followed that by having our mid-cycle yesterday and today. And then tomorrow the enterprise work group is having a mid-cycle. So it's sort of been a mid-cycle fest here in London or in UK this week. So why don't I go ahead and just call off the names, if people would just stand up and so I get a chance to recognize you. So if we chat later, you can get a chance to know who they would be. So Rocky's from Huawei. Okay. Shamail, and Nate and Tyler. It's our IBM contingent. And then from Intel is myself and Leong. And I don't think Pete's not here. Pete is a UX, user experience expert. UX team is also in London for a couple of days here, having a mid-cycle, and my guess is he probably got caught up there. The OpenStack Foundation, Mike? get a chance to talk more with him here in just a little bit. Kenny Johnson from Rackspace. And last but not least, Walmart and Megan Rossetti is in the back. Okay. So how do we actually take requirements and move them through? What you are seeing here is hot off the PowerPoint press, as one of the things that we really focused on for the last couple of days was looking at what our workflow is. We've been executing for about, I'd say about 8 months in the workflow we had coming into our mid-cycle. We talked about what was working, what was not, what's evolved and changed in the community, and how do we go ahead and integrate with that to be able to be more effective and to expedite what we're trying to do. And so the basic flow is we create a user story idea comes in. And it can be something that's well defined. It can be something that's very small. The starting point varies greatly, and all of them are fine, and we welcome them. From there, we go ahead and use the Garrett process to get comments, to have other people to contribute that to them, to help us make them better, right? More detailed, more robust, more reflecting the real needs and requirements of whoever would be the source for that user story or requirement. From there, we'll go ahead and agree that, yeah, this looks like it's complete enough, commit it into the to the repo. At this point, we have a user story repo for the product work group, and then we will go ahead and create a tracker around it. The first instance of a tracker, which will have just some very basic information about the user story. I'll put an ID associated with it, a date it was created, who was the primary author or the lead behind it. And that's the start of something that we'll continue to build out as we move through definition. Once we have the detail and the tracker in place, then we go ahead and we'll put it as a cross-project spec in that repo. And that's how we start to expose it more and bring in the different technical expertise inside of the community to help us say, okay, this is what we want to do. What are the gaps around it? And what are the additional cross-project specs or project specs or blueprints that we would need to define and then implement in order to realize that user story? Okay. As that detail happens, which is what we call the gaps analysis, we'll continue to build out the story tracker to go ahead and reflect those. So that you have one place that you can look at. We have this spec that needs to be implemented, and this spec has these underlying blueprints, and be able to look at the status of each of the blueprints. So really be able to see our status and can realize where we're going. Yeah, Mike?
What's a spec?
What's a spec? Excellent question. I'm going to let you answer that question, actually.
So, spec is usually defining the actual details of how exactly something will be implemented. So, for every single feature, a significant feature inside of OpenStack, that includes grasping what exactly the API impact is, the database impact, upgrade impacts, all things that have to take into consideration for everybody that's affected by the feature.
Okay. Thank you. So specs, blueprints get defined. You can also go ahead and from there track what are the commits against the blueprints as the code gets developed and it moves into the upstream. So it really gives us a full view into where we stand in trying to bring that new capability into the release. We have a series of user stories that we've identified and started to move through the process. And these are the top 4 that we had identified as being the most impactful to advancing the adoption of OpenStack in the markets in which OpenStack is looking to serve. So whether it's an enterprise marketplace or a telco or a scientific computing. And so that's just a small view of what the overall set of user stories look like. There's about 20 in the backlog, and one of the other things we did in our mid-cycle today was to start to generate a list of what did we hear from the ops mid-cycle earlier this week, what are the other things that we've been hearing from customers or partners or operators that we need to start to characterize and be able to bring into the community. So I expect that list is going to rapidly grow. And so this is a place where you can come and help us to make OpenStack a better product or a projects by helping to make sure that we understand what you know about what the markets need, what you hear from your customers, what you experience yourselves, and turning those into user stories that then the community can work to realize. So the next thing we wanted to do was to go ahead and share with you what the community-generated roadmap looks like. And so with that, I'm going to turn that over to Nate.
All right, thanks, Carol. I'm Nate Zeman. I'm with IBM here representing part of the product working group. One of the charters or parts of our mission as being a number of product managers from many of the companies that are contributing significantly to the OpenStack upstream code base is helping to bring together and distill the new features that are being worked on and are coming into various releases within OpenStack, and we call that the community-generated roadmap. So, so specifically, we do this in an hour session at each of the summits. We're going to try to do this in about 5 minutes tonight. So you're going to get a crash course in where do you find it, how do we generate the roadmap, and kind of how do we put that together, and then how do you read the various views that you can do offline. You know, as whether it's a closed system, whether it's an open system, roadmaps always, you know, change. So here's the fine print. We do talk to the PTLs or project technical leads on an every release basis, and they give us a good indication of what is being worked on and what is potentially going to land within a release. There's no guarantee that the entire, you know, an entire feature or function may land in one specific release. And so in part, just like we have user stories and we have those trackers to help track that, you know, those are for the individual pieces that might make up a larger feature. You know, most of the projects, you know, they have their sets of priorities and their own backlogs. So when you look at a feature that may have go across multiple projects, things may land at different times, and we're helping to kind of distill that out and provide the community a chance to see where is OpenStack going, and in the short term as well as in the long term. So in terms of being able to find the community-generated roadmap, the landing page is right on openstack.org on one of the main links. We got a direct link here to the latest set of charts and complementary video content. So as part of the release cycle, we actually talked to the PTLs several times. One, we're putting together actual content that we distill into the roadmap. Additionally, we talked to them in terms of video content that they can provide more detail from their own personal point of view, and their project's point of view. So in terms of building the roadmap, you know, it's done based on a time-based release cycle. And so with any time-based release cycle, there are specific, you know, there's a design summit, which kind of happens right at the summit, and then 3 milestones, at which point that's when we want to talk to the PTLs for each project and find out what is high probability of landing within that last milestone, right? And distilling that all together into several different views. We go ahead and we do interviews with each of the PTLs. We ask them all sorts of specific questions around different themes that they're focusing on, top 3 features that they're focusing on, and take that technical content, really distill it across the projects into some common themes that we'll talk about here tonight. In terms of the approach, we put 3 different views together, and we're going to give you some examples that Shmail is going to take you through here in a minute in terms of how we look at the content that we get. So we look at, you know, upwards of about 15 to 20 different projects and have those interviews, and how do we put together that content with some common themes. If you look at, we kind of organize it by 10,000 foot view, 1,000 foot, and 100 foot. The 10,000 foot view is looking at the themes across the releases and across the entire product. The 1,000 foot view looks at a single release, looks across the product based on specific themes. And then the 100 foot view is per project. So you get to actually see more details on each of the projects, where they're focusing, and what are the significant improvements or new features that are being delivered within that project. Again, it's set up to where they're pretty sure what's going to land in a release, but besides it's open source, it's not always guaranteed. It's time-based and open source, so we kind of get what we get on an individual release. The next release, we get more content that didn't land in that one. And looking at our project coverage, there are more projects than this, but we focus on the projects that have the most adoption based on the user survey data that comes out. So we have some methodology into which pieces of the more mature projects that are being deployed and focusing on those. There are additional emerging projects that continue to gain traction. As they gain traction, we include them here as well.
That actually underscores the importance of filling out the user survey. Yeah. If you haven't already,
thank you very much.
It closes on, I think, Wednesday, 24th.
24th.
So if you haven't done that, go fill it out.
All right. So Shmuel, do you want to come up, talk about kind of how we organize the themes and go through and talk to the different PTLs?
Yeah, so I've been standing in the back the whole time, so please don't squint to see this. As Nate mentioned, it's published on openstack.org/roadmap, so you can download, and this is, much more legible and readable if you're sitting in the back right now. So as Nate mentioned, the way we do this is we kind of work with the PTLs and the project teams to compile a list of what they were working on this release that's about to launch, what they're planning on working on possibly in the next release, and then we also ask them actually a challenging question, which is, where are you going to go 2 releases from now? So even though the design summit hasn't happened and nothing, there are no concrete plans, this at least gives us some sort of guidepost of directionally which theme the project might be targeting. And so the themes that we've used so far, and these can be changed in the future as well, are scalability, resiliency, manageability, modularity, and interoperability. And what they mean is scalability is any item or feature set that impacts the scale at which the service can operate is deemed a scalability item. Anything that impacts the availability or durability of the service or its underlying API is under resiliency. Manageability basically covers anything operations or user experience related. Modularity is actually more of an internal barometer. As you've probably noticed, like with Neutron Stadium and other various projects taking initiatives, project services themselves are kind of decomposing to make the code base smaller on a per component level. And so modularity is, what changes are you enacting that enhance the modularity of the service architecture and therefore result in a more manageable code base or remove duplicity of efforts. And interoperability is a definition that kind of covers a bunch of things. So it covers interoperability, but also compatibility. So interoperability is things that enable federation. So if you're aware of OpenStack interop, which is the capability of common definitions of APIs across OpenStack providers or distributions, that falls under interoperability, as well as anything that enables a common experience across multiple OpenStack powered clouds, as well as anything that takes a service or uses basically a service that's available in another OpenStack project and calls it. So instead of building duplicate capability in a new OpenStack service, if Nova has a capability, we reference it, and therefore we call that as a part of interoperability as well, because there's services relying on services. So with that, as Nate mentioned, so the 10,000-foot view is really meant to be consumed at a per theme level, basically, is the focus here. And as PTLs tell us that we're working on Cells v2 or we're working on a new image upload API, we kind of classify that feature within a theme. And then basically, if there's any feature within that project's plans for a given release, in this case, this was from Liberty, Mitaka, and which was Newton now, but it was called N back then when this slide was built, we checked the box. The interesting thing you can get from this slide, for example, is very quickly we can see, this is always the case, by the way, with OpenStack, is the primary theme was manageability. So usually it's delivery of new features, capabilities that enhance the operations or user experience itself. And it's also interesting that we can see that some projects have very clear goals in terms of what they're trying to do with the project direction. So with Swift, when we asked what you're working on, whether it was Liberty, Mitaka, or Newton, they had something that had to do with scalability. So clearly scalability is one of the design goals of the Swift team. As well as if we look at Horizon, for example, it's modularity, and which shows in the recent AngularJS work they did, for example, which allows other plugins to kind of appear in the same window. The other thing that we can see, by the way, is there's a ... here. I know in the back it's hard to see, but the ... basically means that the team didn't give us any information. And what that means is it's not a yes or a no. It just means that simply we're not prepared to discuss yet. And so the ones that I highlighted in green are ones that had checkboxes in at least 2 of the 3 releases and a no information on the 3rd, which means that more than likely they probably will have something in that 3rd release that probably aligns with this theme. And also, if you look at the Mitaka release materials that came out, modularity was a big theme. As you can see, most projects were working on it. This was a part function of, Cola, partly the Neutron Stadium work, etc. But this data is actually useful for a very high-level view of where projects heading directionally. And also, we work really closely with the OpenStack Foundation. So when you see the release material, so when Liberty was launched or when Mitaka will be launched, they usually reference themes as well. So we've kind of collaborated and made sure that when the new releases come out, we can highlight what were the themes. And this data is partially what's used to come up with that messaging. The next view is a 1,000-foot view. And the 1,000-foot view kind of gives you a little bit more about why a certain service had a checkbox in that last view. And so here we kind of take what features a service might be working on and distill it into like 2-3 words. So for example, as I mentioned, Nova had a checkbox in scalability for Liberty. That was because of they're working on Cells v2. And then it had a checkbox in Mitaka for scalability because they were working on Cells v2 and continuing that work forward. And so there's about 22 projects, and the 1,000-foot view covers all 22 projects across 3 releases in about 5 slides. So a lot of information in a very condensed form, but more information than the 10,000-foot view. If you really are interested in a specific service like compute or image, which is Nova, or glance, we have the 100-foot views. And the 100-foot views are almost basically the raw data that we got from the PTLs, more or less. So in this view, we kind of highlight some of the key things they told us about Liberty, about Mitaka, and about Newton. And we also point you to the actual location, as Carol mentioned, the specs and blueprints for the project itself. So you can actually click this link and go to the exact location where the project team is tracking what they're going to work on next. And we also kind of update, based on Stackalytics data, number of contributors and companies, et cetera. So again, the roadmap right now covers about 22 projects. And we're going to basically refresh it twice every release. Once is during the summits, and the other one is actually done probably about a month to 2 months after the Design Summit. And Design Summit is where the project teams meet, collaborate, and decide and determine their plans for the upcoming release. So you want to make sure we capture a view of what they were thinking going into it and what they are now planning on working now that they've actually had a chance to meet and get together. So that's it on roadmap. Next up is user stories, which is Kenny.
All right, hi. I'm Kenny Johnston. Before I get started, I just want to point out how many people here are like active contributors to any of the OpenStack projects? Okay, and then how many people are like operating an OpenStack cloud in some form or fashion? Okay, cool. I think that's helpful. I wanted to point out, and Carol was talking about this. One of the really cool things that I love about being involved with OpenStack and the product working group specifically is we're building processes that are open to like the whole world, right? It's really cool to think about specs as the kind of open software design process and user stories as the open way of defining new requirements for an open source tool that everyone uses. Just the fact that we're kind of paving new ground and building some of that tooling out at something as big of a scale and kind of as an open source success as OpenStack is pretty cool. It's fun to be involved in personally. What is not fun to be involved in personally is the topic I'm going to talk to you about, which is upgrades. And so before I get too far, how many people have a feeling that, not to use a British phrase I learned, that upgrades are shite? Okay, cool. That's like 50% of the room. It's about right. So I think the recurring, this is why OpenStack is horrible, statements are around Neutron, which we already touched on, and upgrades. And so I want to say, before we get too far into the user story around rolling upgrades, that upgrades have made huge improvements in recent releases. Across the board, across a number of projects, there's been a lot of work amongst the community. The community fully realizes that they need to make upgrades better for operators and users to be able to take advantage of the new features that we're deploying or developing in subsequent releases. So all hope is not lost. It does get better. I realize that a number of people are on older releases where the upgrade path from that release is not as nice as it is from current releases. But I guess stick with us. So rolling upgrades. Again, I work at Rackspace. I spend most of my time through a joint initiative that's directly upstream between Rackspace and our friends at Intel called the OpenStack Innovation Center. You can Google that if you want to learn more about what we do. So rolling upgrades is not like upgrades are super easy and everything works fine. Rolling upgrades is actually so let me take a step back. The community has said upgrades are hard. There are a number of solutions that specific projects like Nova, the compute project, have done to make upgrades easier for Nova. The way that they define that is they call it rolling upgrades. People often use the term rolling upgrades to mean all of my upgrade problems will be solved if you just do rolling upgrades. Not necessarily the case, but rolling upgrades is a thing. Going back to like the product work group's job in this process is to define kind of the business justification and the value of the development effort being put in. It's like, oh, the developers know to do rolling upgrades in any service is really hard. It's actually a kind of difficult technical task. But like, what do we get out of doing that? Well, we can tell them, we hear every time we go in to talk to any customer or any user of OpenStack that upgrades are a pain. We can also tell them that, from a ecosystem perspective, it is the value that you get in the community and the constant evolution of this code you lose if upgrades are painful. Like we saw this at the Operator Summit. Operators will tell you, well, we don't really submit bug patches because we're on an older branch and it doesn't get backported, and who knows when we're ever going to get to master. So what value is that to me to tell you like where I found a bug in the software? So it's important from a success of OpenStack perspective that OpenStack make upgrades easy, because that's part of the value proposition of the community, is that it's a constant evolving software and it's important to stay on the latest release. So yeah, that's what I don't remember when I wrote these slides. It was probably on a plane, and I'm just going to use words instead. So that I wanted to provide a brief technical summary. I said what rolling upgrades isn't. But what rolling upgrades is essentially a way of having an OpenStack service. This is for intra-project services. So within Nova, for instance, there are a number of services like the Nova Scheduler and the Conductor, the API service, Nova Compute. It's a way to not have to bring everything down and then bring everything back up at the new with the new upgraded service. So the idea is you can bring down Nova Conductor first and then replace it with the newer version and have the new version of Nova Conductor working with the older versions of, I'm going to get this sequence wrong, so don't quote me on the sequence, but have the newer and older versions of the various services within a given project operating at the same time and communicating, so that essentially you have a lower downtime impact on that specific service during an upgrade. I use Nova as the example. They're the ones who've done the most work in this process. The other component of that is, a typical upgrade would be bring the whole service down, do a database migration to incorporate the new schema that's required for the new version of the service, then bring the new service back up on that database. They also have a concept of live database migration. Nova's way of doing this is they expand the tables before the upgrade, then they perform the rolling upgrade, and then while your service is running, as different things interact with the database, it does the database migration throughout the service. And so they basically say, you need to complete this database migration before the next release, because during the next release, we're going to contract or remove those tables that should now be empty. So it's I think I call it expand, live, migrate, and then contract process. And then the other component that I always like to speak to, coming from Rackspace as operators, is that it's great if the software is capable of doing this, but it's really important for operators to have tooling that they can use to kind of orchestrate that whole process. So it's not a manual, I'm doing all these processes within the service. You would want to be able to orchestrate that, obviously, across a whole fleet of services and a whole fleet of hosts that are running those services. So there's an orchestration component to live upgrades as well. For those not familiar with the OpenStack contribution or development process, there are regular, like whenever you make a contribution, there are gate tests against that contribution. We're talking about adding improved support for testing rolling upgrades in the actual gate for OpenStack. That would make it so that, you know, it can't just be someone saying, oh, at this point in time our upgrades work, but then we don't really know what happened after that. Maybe somebody broke it. We're finding from Nova's experience that the maintenance of code to ensure that it continues to pass that gate is actually really difficult. It adds a lot of burden to the team. Rightfully so. I think they all recognize it's valuable because it's a big pain point for users. But so I mentioned mostly Nova's work in this area. There are other projects, like I know Cinder has been has been driving on this topic. There are some projects where it's not necessarily applicable. But the idea is that eventually we will get to the point where most, if not all, of the services you're running in your cloud can be rolling upgrade, which would mean that you can do it with minimal disruption to your control plane, and so your users can continue to use the OpenStack API services throughout an upgrade. I don't know if I have another slide. Yeah, so I just went through some of that. There are some specifics in the user story. Who can read that? I don't think I can. Maybe we can, I don't know if there's a mailing list for you guys, but one of the things I would like to do as part of this.
We'll give it to Mark and then Mark can. Go ahead.
All right. One of the things I would like to do is we've drafted this user story. Again, it's open. It's for those familiar, it's in Garrett, OpenStack's review system. I'd love to get feedback. We're kind of an open collaborative group. I'd love to have folks who are interested in rolling upgrades and can speak to their experience on why it's been painful in the past. Review the user story, give us feedback. It's simple inline commenting on written text at this point. So we'll send around that link so we can get feedback from y'all. That's all I have on rolling upgrades. I think Liang is going to talk about VM HA, and then we'll have questions at the end.
Okay. Hi, I'm Leon. I work for Intel. I was just told that I need to squeeze my presentation from 15 minutes to just 5 minutes. That's okay, we can do it. We're doing cloud, right? Elasticity. Okay, so do you guys know about the concept about paths and kata? Okay, so in the paths, that basically means that we have running a conventional workload in a traditional applications, whereby the kata model is more towards a cloud-native application. So the reason that we have this use case is because some of the customers that we have, or some of the vendors that we have that work with, they're looking towards deploying paths kind of model in an OpenStack cloud environment. That's why I need this requirement HA for VM. So basically, this use case, right, is talking about how can we recover or rescue a VM from a different failure events. So how can we achieve high reliability VM so that we can satisfy the SLA requirement from the application user point of view. So, so some of the possible failures events in OpenStack could include VM is down for whatever reason, or the VM provisioning process is not working, or the host or the hypervisor itself is down, or there could be other events such as the networking is failure or anything that can cause the VM to fail. So how can we build an environment of features in the OpenStack so that when something's failed on the VM itself, it can recover by itself automatically. So that's what about HA for VM. And this is one of the proposals being created by NTT. So there's some implementation there, so I have some suggestions on how can we make this work in OpenStack environment. There are also other implementation provided by, suggested by other vendors as well. So different companies today are working together to provide these features in OpenStack. So we try to, that's also one of the purpose for product work group, because we try to bring in different companies to work together to collaborate to each other and try to make features such as this kind of features available in OpenStack. So that's what we're trying to do. So that's about my presentation.